Thank you very much, Jason, and Dr. Carriveau and I are here in beautiful Denton, Texas, and we appreciate the opportunity to do this. We are in an academic building, and it is a building that contains a gym and a pool. As a result, you may hear screams, bounces, or splashes. That's just part of the business of a university. I'm sure you all understand that. So without further ado, Ron, you want to say hello?
And I'll just say hello for now, as Mike is going to start the program, and then I'll come in later.
All right, thank you. So what we're talking about today is relatively self-explanatory in some senses. The title that we've developed is plain, we think. Measure what you value and value what you measure. It seems something that is common sense, and hopefully by the end of the day, you'll have the kind of aha moments that we often have and faculty often have when we talk about this. We're going to treat this as we often do, a casual conversation. Ron and I sit around with faculty a lot and talk about this kind of stuff. We feel strongly about it, but we're going to keep this informal, and we will certainly address questions as we come to the end. So as Jason noted, and you'll see later, this is a shameless plug. This is the first of a three-part series, and we're expanding the topic over the next 2 Wednesdays, same time. So our agenda for the day. First, we're going to talk about outcome-based education and accreditation and try to make some points about the links between the two that we've experienced, and we think you probably have also. We're going to talk about the outcome-based assessment model. Then we'll work specifically about outcomes and outcome statements. And then the 3-level outcomes structure, which is a little more detailed information that serves as the foundation for the conversation. And then we're going to talk about linking test items to this structure. And finally, the calculation and reporting of outcome attainment. So we'll walk through these sections, and I'll kick it off by talking about outcome-based education and accreditation. So those are issues that hit home for us because we're in the process of reaffirmation for SACS, Commission on Colleges, in 2016. Many of you are under the same processes, either regional accreditors or disciplinary accreditors, and you probably are aware of this kind of conversation going on your campus or in your department. So outcome-based education relates to this process, and here's how we see it. So first, there's basically 4 components of this, and it is not rocket science. We create student learning outcomes or expectations, creating an instructional environment to ensure those outcomes, create assessments that measure the outcomes and align with the instruction, and then finally, we use the assessment results to evaluate students in your course. So that's not rocket science, and we've found repeatedly that most instructors have the same sort of conceptual framework for teaching and assessment, and whether they articulate it like this or whether they articulate it another way, it's usually close to this. Most instructors that we work with, at least, have this in their mind. The other thing to note in relation to accreditation, you'll note this is also the improvement cycle. As much as at the program level as is at the course level, we spend a great deal of our time working with instructors, and we think that data is important, but data not used is just interesting information. So our focus is using this information for the purpose of improving instruction. So just a minute about accreditation. What's expected? You'll be familiar with potentially the SACS standard 3.3.1. Other accrediting bodies have a similar statement that the institution will identify expected outcomes for educational programs and its administrative and educational support services, assessment, and then provide evidence of improvement. So that's the cycle we just talked about. It's the improvement cycle, but expressed from an accreditor's standpoint. We look a lot at the instructor standpoint, but it's still that same improvement cycle. And 3.3.1.1 educational programs include student learning outcomes. So I just want to highlight that word, student learning outcomes, because that's what we are talking about. Middle states, similar language. Learning outcomes reported need to be clearly articulated at every level. And we'll get into that today and in the next 3 weeks as well. Structure for calculating and reporting. Convincing evidence and key learning outcomes. So I'll bring those up, just talking about this issue, and I think all of us are in those conversations at one point or another, willingly or not. We have to address these issues. So our premise, and I think that of the accreditors, is, if it's not already there, it's quickly becoming, that grades don't, most times, almost always, don't directly address SLOs, or they don't tell you where improvement is needed in terms of learning outcomes. We're working from that premise. So typically you'd see these kind of reporting statements. Percent of the students who had a C or higher, or the success rate, or the number of students who received A's. There's all kinds of statements that we've all seen and we've probably all produced that attempt to demonstrate outcomes. But I think in our working premise, and we say this a lot here, and we've set it up as we're betting that SACS and accrediting agencies are in the long run not wanting that measuring stick to be grades or success rate, etc. That's not radically, that shouldn't be radical to anyone, but it is a little bit of a movement in a direction that we all need to watch. So just a background on why we talk about this and what we've done. Our current QEP, which began in 2006, is a next-gen course redesign program. It's based on the outcomes-based model using Dr. Carrievo's book called Connecting the Dots. And we give Dr. Carriveau a lot of credit as the theoretical founder of what we're trying to do here, and the outcomes work is integrated into the course redesign and in fact serves as a framework for it. So right now, in practice, we have about 280 course sections that are designated as next gen and over 6,000 students enrollment. Our total enrollment at the university is around 38,000. So over the course of time, basically, we're now in year 7 or 8, depending how you count. We have 772 sections, and over 43,000 students have gone through this a next-gen designed course. And so we have a lot of experience and background and data from which we're drawing some of the conclusions today. We went through our 5th year report with SACS a couple of years ago, and we came out pretty well in our response letter. We got some nice comments from Dr. Whelan, and we've had some very nice responses in a sense as the use of our basically the outcomes model and the measuring as a potential model for others. And again, we've had good success in what we've done so far, so we feel good about it. So let's talk for a minute about this whole network of conversation, and everybody's in this conversation, right? So you see the circles, the web, the network of who's interested, who should be interested, who is interested, and as you walk around the circle, you've got, of course, the students in the courses, which is what drives the outcome, and then you can see the various connections between these. In other words, you want to communicate SLOs and attainment levels to various people at various times. And in fact, probably all these people at all times. I do want to point out one thing that we have really believe strongly here, that communicating the attainment to the students within the course is a very, very important component of the structure. I think many of us in the past were concerned about reporting program or institutional outcomes to accrediting agencies, and so we want to make sure that we have plenty of time to go through the rest of the program. So I'm going to hop ahead, and with Dr. Carrievo's permission, we will give you the basics of this, and he'll get into the model itself. But these are from his book, Connecting the Dots. And you've seen this before. Develop the student learning outcomes, develop the assessments, use those results, and make changes. That's the improvement cycle. And we have as our outcome-based assessment the student learning outcomes linked with test items and then attainment measures, and that's what Ron is going to get into in just a moment. So basically, we're all on the same page with this. The assessment process, asking a student a question, score the response, and decide how the score should be used and interpreted. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ron, who will walk us through the remainder of the conversation and the other items on the outcome. So Ron.
Hello, everyone. Well, we live in an outcome-based world in education. It's become the norm, and that's why the learning outcomes are the base of which everything derives, from which we derive all of our outcome attainment values. And the question always is, what are you going to derive from those outcomes? And we focus strictly on matching it, the assessment components to the outcome statements. So just as a general view, pretty much student learning outcomes are accepted as being an end product, the thing that you want students to know and be able to do when they finish your course. To be more specific, though, and to work with the model, we really have to think in terms of statements. And these would be the statements that clearly state the knowledge, skills, attitudes, competencies, and habits of mind that students are expected to acquire. And this definition is floated around in the literature also. The knowledge usually gets a bad rap with multiple choice items. They say, well, you can't measure much with that, but these are, you can actually measure skills, processes, procedures, concepts with the multiple choice also. We'll talk about that a little bit more and into part 2 next Wednesday. And from an outcome importance level, we work with 3 levels. One is that whatever we're asking the students to know and be able to do, is that worth something that's worth being familiar with? Or is it something that's important to really know and do? And then, is it something that we feel students should remember for years? Should it be enduring? And within that structure, there are 3 basic cognitive tasks that we focus on. One is, of course, the knowing, and as I mentioned before, you can know a lot of things, skills, concepts, procedures, process. But then you need to apply it. So you use that knowledge to solve a problem. So our outcome statements have to also address that level. And then there's the use of that knowledge to make judgments, think critically, and that's what that habits of mind refers to, as the thinking critically, and that is all part of the evaluation. So with those 3 main cognitive tasks, then we move into the measurability. And this, as you know, outcome statements are controlled by the verb. And the other part you have to ask yourself is, what do I expect to see that student do? What do I expect to see them exhibit or demonstrate so I know that they have achieved that outcome? And if you can't answer that, then it's not going to be a measurable situation. And the third is the type of item that will allow the student to show you that the student knows that what they know and can do in terms of the outcome statements. And we'll talk more about that in parts 2 and 3 also. We also use a cognitive complexity continuum because, as we know, there's a continuum of simpler recall type concepts and outcomes that we expect. There's an interpretation level, apply, think critically, and these are tied in with Bloom's taxonomy, and it's easy to go to the web these days and find as many types of outcome statements to match this as you probably need. So let's talk about the three-level outcome structure, because this is the heart of what makes our program successful. And it's not a new concept, because we find, if you look through syllabi from different courses, you'll see outcome statements. This is what the student is going to encounter in this course. And we see them also on the web, different models, the professional accreditation organizations, which write really good stuff, also have them. But typically, there's a little mixture of a broader statement that is not measurable. And then there's sometimes a middle statement. It's not quite so broad, but it's also not quite specific enough for item writing. And then there's a very specific level that's straightforward, easy to understand, leaves no question about what the student is going to encounter in terms of outcomes and assessments. So we start with a model with a big goal: understand. It's a good word, and it works, but it's not easily measurable. So we break it down into a second level, the general learning outcome level, or a 1.1. There could be several 1.1s for every one. And notice the words by at the end of each statement. If you can read that statement and say by at the end of it and add something, then you know there's another level that you can work with. So in the 1.1, where it says students will know and apply the naming system for organic compounds by doing what, then we get specific enough to measure, we get specific enough to write items, and it's more specific for communicating with students and others. That's the 1.1.1 level. So it's very straightforward and simple. 1, 1.1, 1.1.1. And there would be a couple of examples of what the 1.1 levels would look like, and you would have several of these. Therefore, it's 1.1.1 and 1.1.2. Now, validity evidence has to be part of this whole process. And if you have test items that match the SLOs, and you have the instruction that matches the SLOs, and your test items match the instruction, then that's great validity evidence. But you also need test items that have been validated. And we'll briefly touch on that today, but mostly that'll be in part 2 and part 3. So for validity evidence, the most important thing is the item matching the outcome. As an example, if you had an art history outcome and you expected students to be able to relate common elements from different periods, but your art history test items were all focused on identifying paintings from the different periods, then you would have limited use and interpretation of those test results, because what you asked was the students to relate common elements, excuse me, and what you measured was identifying paintings from different periods. So we would have to say that using those test results as was intended would lack validity. And validity comes by degrees. So the most important thing we keep in mind when we're doing this process is that selecting the verbs for those outcome levels, for any one level, that verb is dependent on the relationships between and among the other 3 outcome levels. And we have a lot of training we do with our faculty on getting this very clear and making sure their structure and their verb use all flows nicely. So the big question is, after students have been evaluated, grades are awarded, how do you know to what degree students in your course attained the learning outcome expectations? Another way to put it is, how successful was my course? So what do we need to know in order to do this evaluation, determine course success? We need to know how well students attain the SLOs. And what we need in order to determine the SLO attainment then is a measuring stick that makes a direct connection between the test results and the outcome statements. So now we're going to talk about how we do that. It's all about coding. keeping in mind that level 1, 1.1, and 1.1.1, we would code from the same outcome statements that you just saw, and I took these from a chemistry course. Our faculty write great stuff, and they let us borrow these things. At the third level, where we get down to the item writing, you see it says 1.1, and notice it says specific learning outcome with a little s. That's to designate the difference between this third, or this very specific level of the structure, and the general term big SLO, because all of these are student learning outcomes. But we use a little s to be specific about the level we're on, because that's the level we write the test item on. And the item could be the following molecule contains which following functional group. There'd be a little picture of it. And again, this is an actual item. And those are the three options. So in this case, it sets up as a multiple choice item, but the instructor is really always teaching at that 1.1 and 1.1.2 level, and it could have asked this to be a written response. And they would still be teaching at that specific level, but perhaps with a written response using the rubric at a little bit higher level. And we'll address that too.
Well, let me ask you a question, Ron. Do you find that most instructors have these kind of outcomes in their classes already, or what is your experience in terms of walking up to an instructor and asking them about this?
Yeah, and I've been here since 2006, which is when the QEP was initiated, that we've just finished the 50 report on. And it took about 4 years to find out that there's nothing that is structured well enough that the instructor can immediately start writing items from their outcomes. So when they get the structure down, they're very happy to see it, and then they can answer the questions that students ask. They say, well, you know, we took this course. They didn't really tell us exactly what we're supposed to know and be able to do. Then they taught something different, and then they put these items in that were real hard, just to, I guess, to find out if we're smart or not. And I said, well, what did you do about that? And they said, well, we just eventually figured out kind of what the instructor wanted, and that's how we respond. And I've taught a lot of graduate courses, and especially with education people, and they have that same view. So, number one, it is not easy to write a good set of outcomes. It takes practice and understanding exactly what you want the students to know and be able to do, and mapping it into the structure. So once we get, the reason I pulled this up is because until we started working with ExamSoft, all of this had to be done, and all of the outcome statements had to be developed on either Word or in Excel, and then transferred into some program that we try to get outcome statements from. So with ExamSoft, you can see the structure here is exactly as it was shown. We just looked at these outcome statements. I'm trying to get this mouse. Okay. So that was our general the big goal. This was the GLO, and these were the specific SLOs to which students would be expected to respond in terms of instruction and item writing. Okay, Mike's coming to my rescue. He told me I wouldn't be able to run this little mouse. Okay,
so that's the student, the goal and the student learning and the specific outcomes that you were showing, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So let's talk about how this gets calculated. How do you find out what the attainment of an outcome that has been coded is? And in this case, let's look at this as a 20-item test. And the percentages on the right-hand side are the percentages of students that got each of those items correct. And these could have been from any type of assessment, selected response, constructed response, because they could have written their response and been scored with the rubric, and you can still come up with outcome attainment values. So in this case, let's look at this as like a multiple choice item. Those three items averaged together would produce an outcome, a specific outcome value of 75 or 0.75, but we'll just talk about it in terms of percentage, because we're looking at the class as a whole and the percentage of that outcome that the class attained. It's a peer measure. It comes directly from the test item. There's no extra credits or all the other things that pollute the grades thrown in it. And here's this time 4 items are used to get that outcome average. And in this case, the next set would be 5 items to get the outcomes value for 1.1.3. Now, if you average those 3 together with it's a weighted averaging, then you have something you can talk about at the general outcome level. Not exactly where you're teaching or where the instructor is most interested, but it's a good reporting level, and it's also valuable for the instructor to look back at. But they're going to be more interested in the specific outcome level. And the same thing happens with the rest of the items. Now you have 2 general outcome statement values, and they average up to 80. When we report, say, to the president's report, we work off the goal level. When we report to deans, chairs, we're really reporting more at the general outcome level, because those are all written out. It's clear to see what they match. And if anybody says, how can I believe that 0.80 is really true? Say, well, you can map it backwards all the way down to the specific statement that we taught and that the students were tested on, all the way back to the item that was used for that. And that usually presents a convincing enough argument. So now let's talk a little bit about what can you do with these. We want to report them. So if you want to report this group of SLOs, you can show it on this format. And then you can take those SLO values and put them on another little table to show the attainment at the GLO and the goal level. You can also derive these outcome attainment values from rubric scores. For example, in this case, we have 5 students, and their outcomes on their outcome statements said they were going to write a paper or whatever, and they're going to be scored on clarity, structure, and logic. And their scores are shown there. So first student number 1 had a 3, a 2, and a 2, and student number 5 had a 2, 2, and 1. And under the compensatory scoring, which is typically done, because there were 4 anchor points. If you take the average of all the students, and if you got 2.65 and took that into 4.0, you would have attainment for clarity for that course, for that assessment, at 0.66. And the same thing for structure and logic. Now, some of our folks, like in the writing course and in some other courses, want to use what's called conjunctive scoring, in which case they say, I have a 4-point rubric, but everybody has to get a 3 or 4. You have to be that proficient. So I'm only counting those. So if you have 80% of students who get that 3 or 4, then you have a 0.80 attainment. And I know in nursing schools and a medical school that I've worked with, that they prefer the conjunctive because that way they're not compensating a very poor performance with an excellent one. They all have to be on the excellent side. Now we can report this way, and this is all a lot of paperwork and hard work to do, and our faculty who join our program do this. But you can see that if you know the attainment that you got for any outcomes, then you could set a criterion and say, I'm shooting for this value, and you could calculate the difference. And that's exactly what SACS says. It says, we want to know that you're measuring outcomes. We want to know that you're going to set some type of threshold or benchmark, and did it make any difference? Did you apply the data that you got to improving student performance on those outcomes? Here's what it looks like at the GLO level. And as I said before, you could turn this in more as a report to at a program or to a unit. And then the top level could also be used because we've mapped them all up. It's traceable all the way back mathematically, and you could report at that level. So we've been having a lot of fun with all this over the last several years, and then we found that there's a company, which you know, ExamSoft, that we could work with to get this done automatically. And this is a report from from the chemistry course that we use the outcome statements from. And if you haven't seen this, I imagine many of you have, but this is extremely valuable for us because it has the structure in. You can see the goal level has values, the 1.1 level has those values, the specific outcomes have values, and those are the blue averages, and they become then the outcome attainment value. And you can see at the top the average score, and then the lowest scoring students, and the lowest scoring and the highest score, and the bar chart. So this eliminated a lot of having to build things in Word or Excel, calculate out in Excel, map them up, and put them in the tables that we just looked at that are required of everybody in our program. And on the next page, it brought it to a whole new level. We're still working with this because we've been reporting at the course level. Now we have the opportunity, just this last year, to look at the specific outcome levels that can be given to a student. This is great for formative assessment, and again, we're going to go into both of these last two slides with these values more in part 2 and part 3.
And this is the report that optionally you could send to the student. It gives them the feedback, strengths, and improvement against each learning outcome and tells them comparatively how they scored against their colleagues. And the diagram, the indicators on the right we'll talk about more in part 2. You can also do this and give the student the rubric that you're using if you're scoring a written response. And as you know, that's the value of the rubric, is helping the students see what they're expected to, the quality and the quantity they're expected to have for any particular outcome statement. In this case, the outcome statements on the left-hand side are at the specific level, 1.2.1, 1.2.2. Typically, rubrics more operate at the 1.1 level, the general outcome level, but this worked out well for this chemistry course. And of course, the students also would see this from their written response. And again, those are the outcome attainment values. And so we do have something to map into our structure. This was the essay test. And you can see the same statements there, just measured with the written response. And stay on there a minute for you to look at it. Sorry if I rushed you through there. And you can see again the red diamonds for the range of low and high score, and then the average with the blue triangle. So while this is an important for the institution because you can get data, this really is designed to give that feedback to the instructor. This is a where are we in the course as a result of this particular assessment. And we're going to focus on that formative assessment in part 2. So we're really at the end here, and we see that we can report outcome attainment at the course level, and we can say the class as a whole met the criterion on 4 out of 5 learning outcomes. The accreditors love this. The class met the criterion on both general outcomes and the overall goal. This can be reported, looked at by the instructor, but also reported at any level. An improvement goal is to raise the general outcome criteria to 82%. Our improvement goal is to increase the difference in the goal 1 attainment by 5 points within a year. This is something that is very objective. You can grab a hold of it,
and then you can use the data to go back and look at your course, look at your instruction, and make decisions, instructional decisions. And we put the program level in this this number 1 presentation, even though we're going to talk about it more in the next 2. But at the program level, you could say things like students in the program met the criterion on 4 out of 5 specific learning outcomes. The program met its criterion on general outcome 1, 3, and 4, and on goals 1 and 2. Or a program improvement goal is to bring the attainment rate for general outcome 2 up to the criterion level. And everybody would know what we're talking about because it's all laid out in both the outcome structure as well as the assessment structure.
So one of the things that we like to add at this point is what are the pain points here. And what this has allowed us to do is flip the conversation legitimately about outcomes and their measurement, not about reporting and the hassles of it. And that's where we'd all rather be, I think, talking with faculty and programs and deans and everybody else about actual outcomes and whether they're measurable and how good they are, not so much whether you're going to use this system or that system or put it in a spreadsheet. Or that's where the conversation stayed for a long time. And so when we started partnering with ExamSoft, it's been almost 3 years now, and having this conversation, we could see that potential in this product, and it has evolved to the point where we feel it gets us away from the bureaucracy conversation, basically.
And Jason, we've run the time tight, but we can answer questions or hear comments at this time.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Simmons and Dr. Carriveau, for sharing your expertise with us. We do have a few questions that I believe many participants will be interested in getting some answers. The first question is, how did you get faculty to buy in to developing the GLOs to SLOs? What was the incentive, and do they have to do this each academic year?
Well, originally, it was a QEP requirement. And so when I first came here, the QEP was written in such a way that SACS, before I got here, they told the vice provost that hired me that they needed to find someone to work with measurement, since the way they wrote the QEP had talked so much about outcomes and measuring it. And at that point, it became a requirement for folks who got into our Next Gen program. And at that time, a grant of $12,000 a year was offered, so they would participate for 4 semesters. And then that has evolved, and since Mike took over several years ago, and I'll let you tell how that evolved and what the requirements are now.
It's been an interesting transition. So to answer the question, initially it was a harder conversation and some significant incentive was required. But as we all know, this outcomes conversation has evolved over the years. And now there are many faculty members doing this who aren't a part of this program and don't use ExamSoft, for example. That we find they don't have to be a part of this. We provide some incentives now. Folks are going through Redesign. We have 6, 7, 8 courses at any given time, and they have some financial incentive. It's far less now. We found that it wasn't the money. After a while, it wasn't the money. I mean, we reduced it every year, and the same number of people came. So what was the key? It was the overhead. It was the what extra are you asking me to do that was the real magic trick, and that's what sent us off on this search for things like ExamSoft, because they didn't disagree with the theory. They didn't mind talking about objectives and outcomes. They didn't mind assessing well, but they did mind the extra, I got to put this in a spreadsheet kind of stuff. And once we started moving down that road and making it easier with and eliminating, or at least reducing the overhead. You can never reduce the need to write quality outcomes and do good assessment. But the extra stuff in the reporting side, I think that's where we've made some success. So it's not so much more about the money, it's about the not adding to faculty workload. So that's been our approach. It's evolved over 7 years. It was not, starting that way, but we've evolved there, I think.
And one of the comments that almost all of our folks make after they get into this is, writing outcomes was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I've been teaching for a lot of years. But it's also been the most rewarding, because now I know exactly what I'm expecting, and I can communicate that with the student. And I always say, and you sleep better at night, right? And they say, yes.
Excellent. Thank you. The next question is, when labeling questions in ExamSoft, do you add the goal, GLO, and SLO, or do you only tag with the SLO?
Right. We tag at 3 levels. The goal and the SLO, and the 3 levels, the GLO and the SLO. That allows the database to work. You could just tag the goal, but in order to use the 3-level structure, you've got to get to that very specific outcome level in the course that's mapped to items.
Thank you. Who sets the percentage level of attainment for the outcome? Is it the curriculum committee?
Well, it depends, right? It's
by course.
Or in core assessment, there are institutional standards that are set. In some departmental accreditation assessments, there are standards that they've set in their assessment plan. I mean, it varies, but generally it starts at the course level. In our specific redesign program, it's always the instructor's call, unless they have some external mandate from either a program, degree, or external accreditor. But generally, the faculty sets that attainment value.
And we're still working with IR and E to see how this maps in with the full campus, because each instructor will have their criteria and criterion, and then a department would have to buy into that and set something together. And that hasn't happened, and that would be a very interesting conversation, because now that the outcomes are so specific, we can state at the goal level how students are doing with a good measurement. And the question would be to ask the next, the administration above that, so what exactly is it that you are looking for? And we'll show you next week how this maps into the program level, and how the program level maps into the institutional level, but there has to be some agreement on what those outcomes are. In part 3, we'll get a little bit into the NILOA's work and the scoring the value rubrics from ACNU and the DQP. Everybody's trying to get something written down that says this is what a student should look like when they finish this program, or this is what they should look like when they finish this course, and all the sections maybe should match. This is just the vehicle that can answer all of those questions. And where we are now, it's only course values that are being reported.
Thank you. The next question, how do you use the KR20 score as a measure of exam reliability? Should faculty be looking at this in the summary report?
Yeah, I think they should look at the KR20. It's a good value, but it's considered to be the lowest threshold value. So if you have a KR20 of 0.85, that means treat it as that being a low threshold. There are, well, they'll use a Cronbach alpha for the written responses, and it depends on how much faith you want to have in the KR20. But if you have, if you're looking at what's on the screen now, you notice that's 0.84. Okay, that's pretty high reliability, and it would be expected to be high if you have the outcomes and the items matching. And if you set it up to where your GLOs are subparts of the domain that you're measuring with your goals. So I would say look at it if it's below 90 in the literature, then it's too low. But I would say if you get anywhere between 0.80 on up, then it would be something that would tell you that you have good consistency and internally, as well as if you did a repeated assessment. So it's just it's a good number. I know that we could argue about it, but there's actually an omega value that the high-level psychometricians use instead of it. But it's something that you definitely should look at, and so it's a good thing to have on your report.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We have a couple more questions. One being, can you go into more depth on the premise you shared at the beginning of the presentation that grades do not directly assess SLOs? Or yeah.
We're fighting on who wants to answer that, but I will defer to Ron on that one.
Grades and the literature supports this strongly. That grades are a polluted measure, and we got to have them. If the whole world shifted to outcome attainment values right now, it would mess up all the transfer of students to different institutions. But I know in one of our Texas, a large school district, they just sent notices home to the parents that no longer will you receive grades. You will receive how well students do on achieving the outcomes. I don't know how they're going to measure that for sure, but that's my understanding. So with a grade, you have extra credit, extra chances, credit for showing up for class, and I have about 30 things listed from a book from Thomas Halladina that shows all the things that make up a grade. So you get away from the actual student performance, the student competency, the student proficiency. And that's why the outcome attainment value is what SACS and other accreditors are asking for.
So that's cake. Let me add a little icing. We all know in the context of a university, in the context of student success, there are other factors that we're being asked to look at, and your question is, do they go in the grade or are they somehow accounted for otherwise? And I don't think any of us have cracked that nut. So is participation important? Is attendance important? Those kinds of things are fair, but do they measure learning outcomes? So, but as a faculty member, you've got to somehow deal with those. And as Ron said, there's so many factors in the grading that you can't just throw it out. There's lots of practical reasons. But if you're talking purely measuring learning, I think it's a fair approach. Now, we argue about this some here, and there's a lot of arguments about it, but we'll stick with that statement. We'll stand behind it.
And competency is now a big issue and being implemented around the country, and that's based strictly on the student performance on some type of assessment.
Thank you. We have one final question. Going back to tagging, what would happen if you just tagged SLOs?
You'd get a report back that just showed the SLOs. And what's so great about the tagging program is you can tag anything. You can even double tag things. You could have all of your levels tagged, the three level structure, and then you could also say, you know what, these particular 5 items are measuring critical thinking, so I want them to also have a report, and you can then get those items as measuring the outcomes that you're using for, say, the AC and U value rubrics.
But I've also then got to put the value rubrics in there because the structure would need to aggregate or accumulate to that. In other words, it's a separate tagging. I'm double tagging. So there's no issue with tagging this the SLOs, but our structure requires sort of this averaging up, this aggregating, and that's why we have it at the 3 levels. But absolutely, just tagging the SLOs itself is possible and not.
If you wanted to just operate off of the specific level, that would be fine, because really that's what's happening anyway. The aggregating up is just a convenient way to report.
Right.
But the action's at the little SLO level. You could also throw in Bloom's taxonomy in there, as part of the tagging too, or concepts. And I've seen the reports from nursing schools and medical schools that do that. I mean, it's very, universal. What's the word? Flexible, universal, adaptable. Works great.
Excellent. We have just a couple minutes left. Any final thoughts?
Well, I think we want to set the table, and hopefully we've whet your appetite for the conversations to come next week. We've talked about the structure for doing this, but the notion of both reporting and using it in the larger senses institutionally and programmatically, but also, and more important to us, the idea of improving instruction. That's really where we spend a lot of our time. How can you do this? And we've got some great examples of our faculty members and others who do this, use this information to improve instruction. So I think, our